Hello everybody, welcome to my first MinerMancers DevLog. I'm Steve, I'm sometimes known as Sinbad online. If we've crossed paths sometime in the last 25 years, hello again. So this is MinerMancers. It's a game about silly wizards going mining together. You and up to 3 friends go on missions to mine resources in caves infested with monsters. You go out there, you dig out the level, you collect stuff, and hopefully you survive to get back to base to bank it all. Then you can level up, tweak your build, and then go out and do it all over again. It's a bit like Deep Rock Galactic if you played that. It's a game my wife and I love a lot. But this time it's top down and it's got silly wizards.
No! I dropped my lunch in there.
Maybe firstly let's talk about engines. I'm old enough to have created my own engines in the past. In fact, if you're old enough like me, you might remember Ogre 3D, an open source engine which I founded and led for about 10 years in the end. That was a long time ago, but this time I needed to focus on the game and not the technology, so MinerMancers is using Unreal Engine. I still publish open source stuff, you can find a bunch of it on GitHub, and I publish a bunch of Unreal plugins there in case you're interested in stuff that goes into MinerMancers and other projects. In MinerMancers, our use of Unreal Engine 5 isn't strictly typical. Lumen and Nanite are the headline features people talk about when they talk about Unreal Engine 5, but we're not using either of those. They don't really suit this project. In a top-down game, we don't really need complex LOD like Nanite. And since a lot of our geometry is fully dynamic, Lumen doesn't really work either, since it relies on pre-built mesh SDFs. We get away with using a lot of small fill lights and subsurface effects to soften our lighting, which is relatively cheap in a deferred shading model like Unreal uses. So you might ask, why are we even using Unreal 5 if we're basically just turning off all the headline features and running it like a Unreal 4 class engine? Well, one thing is UE5 has taken big strides on tooling. We do a bunch of our work inside Unreal that we previously would have to do in a modeling tool like Blender, which means that we're not dealing with the export-import process as much as we would do by using the inbuilt Unreal tools. Mari still works in Blender and does all of the meshes there, but we rig and animate entirely within Unreal now. Control rig has been a huge deal for us. Once it's set up on a character, it's so much faster to tweak the animation without having to go backwards and forwards between tools. It also helps me personally because I tend to get rusty on Blender quite quickly. I don't use it that regularly, so if I had to go back there and do animation in Blender, I'd find it more difficult. So it's nice for me personally to be able to do a lot of animating inside Unreal. So let's talk a little bit about the view that we chose for this game. Obviously we chose a top-down third-person style of view rather than a first-person view, and that was for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we're a small team, it's just me and my wife Mari, barring any sort of assets that we buy or outsource to other people. So keeping the playfield mostly 2D keeps the scope down a little bit. Games are hard to make as it is, and multiplayer games particularly. So this is one way to at least make our life slightly easier. But secondly, top-down kind of works better for a mining game, I think. You can see the ore veins stretching into the rock, or you can get a little sneak peek of something that might be behind a wall that you could dig through. If you're in first person, you can't really see that sort of thing. You can only see things on the visible surfaces from your point of view. So that's why, for example, Deep Rock Galactic put all of their mining resources generally on the inner skin of the caves, because that's all you can really see. So once we realised that being 2D gave us the advantage of being able to see more and entice the player to go and dig things out, we kind of really leaned into that. And it affected the lighting as well. In earlier prototypes of the game, we had a much more realistic style of lighting. The caves were very dark, and you had a very localised light source that you carried or dropped. But the problem with this is, even though it was more realistic and kind of moody, it really hid all of the resource veins that you would want to be digging out, because the light wouldn't reach to those places. So we quickly found, after we did a bunch of different prototyping, that we wanted a much less realistic style where you had an overhead light that tracks the character and just lets you peek over the edges to see where things might be happening that you just need to dig a little way to get to. Lastly, for this video, let's talk very briefly about the Destructible world and how it works in our case. This is a big subject, so I'll just give you the headlines for now, and I'll do a dedicated episode on it later. So, obviously this is a mining game, so the world has to be destructible. There are different approaches that we could have taken. You could use a grid where whole cells disappear at a time, or you could use clusters of meshes which are removed or replaced as you dig. We tried a few different options, but in the end we went with a variant of marching squares, where you build a geometric surface out of a grid of densities. This gave us the more organic look that we wanted, while still being relatively simple to implement. If you're not familiar with the marching squares technique, imagine a grid of density values where 0 is an empty space and a value greater than 0 is solid, with higher values meaning a larger solid area around that grid point. You build up the geometry one square at a time, hence the marching squares, using a set of predefined cases based on whether each corner is solid or empty. And then you use the relative density to shift the vertices along the edge of the square so that it gives you a more varied look than simply treating each corner as solid or empty, like a binary value.
My cousin fell in once. He was never the same.
Typically, articles you read about marching squares only deal with a single solid content type at a time. It's just one density field and it's either solid or empty. But in MinerMancers, we have a lot of different types of solid level content, different rocks, different resources. The naive way of dealing with this would be maybe to have one density layer per content type and then run marching squares across each one in turn. But this adds up really quickly. We can have up to 32 types of solid content in our maps. If you build each content type as its own marching squares layer, not only is that up to 32 passes of the same area, any points where two solid content types meet will have lots of internal faces where they overlap that aren't really visible. It's a bit of a waste. Not to mention that MinerMancers is a multiplayer game, so we need to send all this map data over the network. Potentially 32 separate density fields is kind of overkill. In practice, different solid content types are not going to coexist in the same space, so instead we use a single density grid. Well, technically it's two, one for the above ground content and one for the ground content, which can have chasms in it, but you get the idea. The density grid differentiates between solid and empty, regardless of content type, and then each node in that grid has one associated content type. We extend the marching squares algorithm to split geometry where content types differ, so different solid content types can meet without creating unnecessary wall edges. This leads to a fair number of additional variations over the standard marching squares, but it's manageable. This makes geometry for different content types meet nicely without hidden faces. It drastically cuts down the amount of data we have to store and communicate to other players as the map changes.
Where does this stuff go anyway?
Now, doing plain marching squares is fine, but it still looks kind of boring. You can still see the underlying grid. So we also distort the grid, both in X and Y and in the height, to make it a bit more interesting. Then the edges are further broken up by adding instanced meshes as lumps. These also double as collectible resources when it's a mineable resource, but how we deal with that is subject of another video. For now, let's just say that distorting the grid and adding these lumps does a lot of the heavy lifting to make the map look more organic and less like a grid, which is secretly what it is. So I think that's enough for the very first video. I don't want to go too far into any of these subjects because each one could deserve its own video. On that subject, future videos, I'm open to suggestions of what people might want to know more about, but things I've got in mind are some more detail about the level data, how it works in multiplayer, how the geometry is built and updated, the instance geometry, so that's things like the lumps, items on the ground, that sort of thing, how it's all kept consistent across multiplayer, how it transitions from being static to falling out of the walls when you mine it, and the whole consistency thing of that in a multiplayer game. Tooling, I think, might be interesting for people to hear about. We built systems for creating chambers and defining those object growths that you see. and people might find that interesting to hear about, I think. I can also talk about the enemy AI and the director that decides when to spawn enemies and how many, for example. And there's also the map UI, which had a particular set of challenges to solve, which I wrote a blog post about a little while ago, but might be interesting to go into in more detail. But let me know what else you'd like to hear about, either in the comments here or just hit me up on Mastodon. There's a link down in the description. For the moment, these devlogs are playing catch up because they're not really reflecting the things that I'm directly working on right now, because I probably should have started doing this months ago, but here we are. I'm going to try and do one of these maybe once a month if I can. If you have any requests, please do let me know, because it might incentivize me to actually schedule these things in when my to-do list is always begging me to work on bugs or new features instead. So it might incentivize me to actually get off my bum and do this. Anyway, thank you so much for watching and listening to me ramble. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.
I'd still weigh so much.